Hello and welcome to the Bucket Lister podcast. Join your host Keith Crockford along with special guests who have travelled the world, here to share stories of their adventures and plenty of inspo to add to your bucket list. Now, let's get into today's episode.
Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. I am your host Keith Crockford, and today I am flying solo again because I've got no one to talk to this week because Jake's away in Morocco again. And it gives me actually a good opportunity to talk about what I wanted to talk about today, and that is Lukla Airport again. And although things have calmed down a little bit now, I just wanted to kind of do this short podcast today to talk about the problems we've had with Lukla Airport and Everest Base Camp Island Peak trips in October. Obviously, I did a podcast, a good couple of months ago now, with the changes to flying from Ramechhap rather than Kathmandu. So just to recap, if you haven't heard that episode, the government in Nepal, they made a change during the peak seasons of Lukla. So in the spring season and the autumn season, that flights weren't going to fly from Kathmandu. They were going to fly from Ramechhap, which is about a 4.5 hour drive from Kathmandu. I'll put a link to the show notes where I go into more details of that. But what happened at the start of October was that the weather in the valley was so bad that flights were not flying, and it caused quite a lot of problems in Ramechhap and also in Lukla with people getting stuck. And I just wanted to kind of go over today what happens if that happens in reality, because obviously people need to be prepared for it because it's the weather and there's not a great deal anyone can do about it. Now, flights going into Lukla, obviously it's apparently the world's most dangerous airport, and obviously they are very cautious with when they are flying, and the slightest bit of cloud cover, they need to have a certain amount of visibility to be able to fly, and for long periods of time they just didn't have that. And in the end, there was a few days before our group got there, our first group for the autumn season, there was kind of 2 or 3 days where flights hadn't gone for, and then they started flying again, and then our group then arrived down to Ramechhap ready to fly the next day, and it pretty much was 6 days without any flights heading to Lukla. Now, bearing in mind, there are between 30 and 40 flights a day, with each aircraft carrying 14 passengers. That soon amounts up to quite a lot of people. I mean, our first group, our Everest Base Camp group that went out, they were stuck for a day, and then 3 flights managed to fly the next day. And we actually managed to get 2 of those flights for our group. So we were really lucky with that our group did manage to get away on that one. But our Island Peak group wasn't so lucky. And there were no flights then for 6 days. At one time, there was reported that there were 2,000 people waiting to fly to Lukla in Ramechhap, which is just a crazy amount of people. And obviously we changed the way we run our trips now, because what a lot of companies were doing, or what they're still doing actually, is they're staying in Kathmandu, getting up at like 2:30 in the morning, and then driving down to Ramechhap for a flight first thing. What we're doing is leaving in the afternoon, getting down to Ramechhap the night before, so groups have got a chance to go to bed, have some sleep, and then get up in the morning ready for their flight. But what that did mean for our groups, and we were really fortunate, was that they had accommodation throughout where they were staying and they didn't get kicked out. So we were really lucky with our groups to have that, because there was plenty of people that were just kipping here, there and everywhere because there was nowhere for them to go. Obviously, the other problem they had was that helicopters were also not flying for quite a lot of it. And then obviously the demand for helicopters then just became absolutely ridiculous, because everybody was trying to get onto helicopters. And that's one thing that I want to kind of make a point about, is that obviously flights are booked, and we will do everything we can to get people on flights. And I think that's the important thing about going with a company, because ultimately, you've got people on the ground who are doing the work for you to get this sorted. There was so much pushing and shoving and people being moved, and you really had to put pressure on to get anyone to commit to anything. But I think in essence, if you are going out to do an Everest Base Camp trek, I think you do need to budget potentially to have a journey in a helicopter as well, just in case. Now, obviously, you will get your flight refunded if you cannot get on the flight. And then that can go towards the balance of the helicopter flight. But, a helicopter flying up was $2,500, and 5 passengers can go in a helicopter at any one time now. It used to be 6, but they've taken it down to 5. So it pretty much works out at about $500 to have a seat on a helicopter. Now, that becomes a little bit more important when you need to come back from Lukla, if you've got your return flight booked on the way home. So I think people just need to have that in mind and have a contingency that hopefully it doesn't happen. But there are chances that then could happen to you if you were on an Everest Base Camp trek. With our Island Peak group, they were unfortunate. They didn't get to fly the same day that our Everest Base Camp group did. And they were stuck in Ramechhap for another 2 days. And, every night, I'll put a link onto the show notes, but there's a really good YouTube video. It's a live video of the runway and of the airport at Lukla. And it kind of 12:30 every night, I was going on it to have a look and see what the weather was doing in the morning, to see if our groups were going to get a chance to fly that day or not. Because, generally, the weather in Lukla is pretty good in the morning, and then it gets worse sort of towards lunchtime and into the afternoon. The cloud comes in. But on this occasion, quite often, Lukla looked clear, but it was clouds further down the valley that were preventing planes from taking off, and they had closed it beforehand. So anyway, the Island Peak group couldn't go, and we were looking at other options. And in the end, we made the call for them to get a 2-day, to get on the Jeeps and drive up to Paplo and trek in from there, which was quite a big decision to make, really, because we kind of sat there and we had to make the decision on the morning. And we were looking at the weather for days to come. And we didn't want to make the decision, and then 2 days later planes were going, and our group were then having to do an extra 2 days trek to get to the start point almost. But as it was another 4 days after we made that decision to when planes started flying. So our group were already ahead of where others would have been at that point. So in the end, it was actually the right decision to make. But it did mean that we had to juggle the whole itinerary around for the group. They still managed to get and do Island Peak. But, it was a decision that we had to make that morning. We didn't have any more days contingency. We were already short on days for that trip as it was, in terms of the delays that they had at Ramechhap. So, luckily they were a really strong group. They managed to get back off Island Peak and come down quicker and gain another day on the way back, just to give them an extra contingency day for flying home. But it was a little bit of a panic at one time. And I think if you're thinking of doing an Everest Base Camp trek, then you really do need to be considering your contingency days, either before and at the end of the trek as well. So it might be that you end up with a bit of extra time in Kathmandu at the end if everything goes well. But I think you would much rather that than potentially miss your flight home on an international flight because of that. And that comes to another thing as well about, your insurance cover, and looking at misconnection of flights, and seeing if you would be covered for that just in case that did happen to you. But there are other options there, and it's one of those things that you do have to consider if you were going on a trek like that. And I was speaking to other company owners that had groups and that was stuck in Ramechhap, and it was, they were turning some of their groups back and going and doing an Annapurna circuit trek because they just didn't have the time frame left to get on the flights to get Everest Base Camp in. Now, I'm not saying don't go and do Everest Base Camp, because obviously it's it's an amazing trek. It's once in a lifetime trek. But what I am saying is this is adventure travel, and it's, there's nothing we can do about the weather, unfortunately. And I know it's really frustrating, and I can understand it from a client's perspective when they're stuck in Ramechhap and, they can't get out and do their trek. But ultimately there is nothing that can be done about it. And, even the few helicopters that were actually managing to fly, it was carnage in Ramechhap, because what was happening was it was becoming a bidding war. Like, there were a few nationalities, and I'm not going to name the nationalities, but, they were paying 3 times the amount to get on the advertised price to get on a helicopter. And I knew groups that had helicopters booked, and when the helicopter came in, a load of cash got thrown at the helicopter company, and they just ended up taking another group because they were paying 3 times the money. Now, I don't agree with that at all. I mean, that's, who's got that sort of money to be throwing away to get on a bidding war to get on a helicopter? But I think, you have got to have an open mind when you are going to go and do a trek like that. I mean, we've never had it like we had it this October. This October was the worst I've known it from a weather perspective. But I think, what I'm trying to highlight here is the fact that you really do need to have an open mind, have some contingency days, and just be prepared that things are going to change. We do have acclimatization days on the trek, which we don't really want to lose we don't really want to lose them, because they're important for climbing safely and for everyone acclimatizing properly. We have got the opportunity on the way back to catch up a day on the way back. And we know this. So, we've got some extra contingency in there when we're planning it. But I know a lot of people were not even going from Kathmandu to Ramechhap. They were driving straight to Jiri, and then again having a couple of extra days trekking in to start, because they knew that with 2,000 people already stuck in Ramechhap, there was no point them going up there and joining the queue, in essence. So yeah, that's the problems that we had. We obviously dealt with it the best we could. Luckily, all of our groups managed to have the trip that they were wanting to do. But I know there were plenty of other groups that didn't have that option, that did go in, turn around and go off and do a completely different trek in the Annapurna region or somewhere else, because, they just didn't have the time frame. So I think, it's just about having an open mind, knowing that it could be a problem, and kind of having that contingency in place, as well as having that additional budget if you are going to need to get a helicopter. And I think, there are other things. There were helicopters that were managing, they couldn't land in Lukla, but they could land slightly further down the valley, and then people were able to trek up from there. And I think it's just knowing what your options are. And I think if you are with a company that know what they're doing and do it all the time, those decisions can kind of be made for you. And I think the biggest problem is I think the way the culture is in Nepal is, from the outside, it kind of looks like that not a lot's happening. But trust me, there was a lot happening behind the scenes to make sure, every option was looked into and we could get there. So, if you think nothing's happening, and from the looks of it, things probably look like they're not happening, but they really are. That's just kind of the culture over there. And, someone is pulling the strings behind it, but you do need to make sure that you are with a company that is backing you up. And we were, our leaders on the ground were in contact with the UK team. The UK team were in contact with our team in Kathmandu, who were in contact with the airlines, and it was just kind of one big circle going round to try and get everything sorted. But it happened, and it happened successfully, and with the right decisions in the end to allow us to achieve what we got out there and did. And like I say, I don't want that to put people off, because it is an amazing trek. But I just think you just need to be, weather is one of those things that, although the Bucket List company is an amazing company and we'll do whatever we can, there are some things that we can't really control. In the weather, and the weather in Lukla is unfortunately one of those things. But we will do everything we can. And other companies are doing the same. We're not the only ones that work hard. But, I just want people to kind of realize that this is adventure travel and things happen. And, the guide on the ground can't really do a great deal when it comes to the airlines and when it comes to the weather. But that also mean that, look at what else is around trek wise, because it could be that, you might go and you might think, well, my backup plan is going to be an Annapurna base camp trek, or my backup plan might be, to go to Pokhara and do something else if that's the situation. And, you might have to go back and do it another time, which, very rarely is going to happen. Like I said, this was the worst October I've ever known. And I think part of the biggest problem and why it was highlighted so much was because the problem was in Ramechhap and not in Kathmandu. Obviously, Kathmandu has a lot of restaurants, it has a lot of hotels, it has a lot of infrastructure. Ramechhap still doesn't have that at the minute, and having that many people stuck there really highlighted the situation. Obviously, other options you have is you can still get a helicopter from Kathmandu, and if it can land in Lukla, and you don't have to go to Ramechhap. So I know that is an option. That's something that you can pre-book before you go out. Obviously, again, the weather is still going to limit you if you can't land in Lukla, but you might be able to land slightly further down. If you can't fly, then you are still in Kathmandu. You're not in Ramechhap. Obviously, that's going to have a massive cost implication on your trip if you're going to fly from Kathmandu in a helicopter rather than Ramechhap. It's a lot further. But again, just look at what your options are. We've just done a couple of trips for small group trips for people who want private groups, and one of those is booked a helicopter from Kathmandu rather than traveling to Ramechhap. It's not something that we're going to look to do for our group trips because the cost is just too much. But if it's something that you want to do on a private trip, then we can certainly accommodate that, and that's not a problem. But the one thing I will say is generally it's the cost of a helicopter, and you have to cover the cost of that helicopter, and then you can have up to 5 seats in the helicopter. But obviously what you've also got to consider there as well is if you have got a guide with you, then you're going to have to pay for your guide to go on the helicopter with you as well if your guide is traveling from Kathmandu. Obviously, if you're meeting your guide in Lukla, that's not a problem. But you do need to think about the costs involved in that and whether you would need one helicopter or two helicopters, depending on the size of your group. And that's our problem is, we were looking for our group. We needed 5 helicopters to move our group. And with our Island Peak group, we needed 3 helicopters, and we managed to get 2 helicopters, but we couldn't get the third, and then we didn't want to split the group. So you're constantly having to make decisions and juggle like that. So, like I said, this isn't to put anybody off Everest Base Camp. It's the most amazing trek, and if it's on your bucket list, then you should certainly go and do it. All I wanted to do was just to kind of highlight some of the problems that we've had this year. Or this month. This goes out on the 1st of November, but I'm recording this podcast still in October, just about. And I just want, people to be aware that, they do need to think about that everything doesn't always go to plan. And that kind of highlights the importance of having a good team looking after you to make sure they can help you as well. But that's all I wanted to say today. Hopefully you found this podcast useful. It's highlighted, some issues that you might come, how to prepare for those issues. And, I don't want it to be completely doom and gloom. But I think, highlighting that so you are prepared and you can kind of understand and know what your options are and what you could be asking for and what, how you can overcome those problems. I thought it would just be useful to go into that. So anyway, that's all from me today. Thank you ever so much for listening. Hope the clocks have gone back. It's pitch black and it's really early. So hopefully, and actually I am heading out to Nepal in a couple of days as well. So, but I will be back next week for another episode. And I've got a really, really interesting episode next week where we're talking everything about Aconcagua. And I'm chatting to one of our clients who went to Aconcagua a few years ago and looking at that trip for climbing Aconcagua. So if that's something of interest to you, then make sure you listen next week. But I will catch up with you then. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. Be sure to click follow to be alerted for next week's episode. For more travel inspiration, check us out at www.thebucketlistcompany.co.uk or follow us on socials. See you next time.